Good afternoon. Welcome to the Partners in Pain session this afternoon. My name is Michelle. I will be your facilitator for this afternoon. So thank you so much for joining us. As we gather today, before we begin, it's important that we offer a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that we are all on treaty land and we are all treaty people. I am joining you today from Yorkton, which is in Treaty 4 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. Recognizing that this history is important to our future and our efforts to close the gap in health outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. So just a little bit of a background for what's going to happen this afternoon. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Partners in Pain, a couple housekeeping tips, and then introduce our first speaker. So Partners in Pain grew out of the Improving Pain in Saskatchewan collaborative research project, which started over a year ago. And the research program, a project aimed to give pain a voice by bringing people together to share information and plan action on how to improve pain in Saskatchewan and how it is managed in our province. The research project led to our first pilot series of the webinars back in March 2021, which seems like eons ago now. So the feedback, doesn't it, Celine? It kind of seems like a long time ago. It's not that long ago. I feel like COVID time is like 4 times what it normally is. So the feedback from the pilot was very positive and led to the research team to seek additional funding to support the continuation of the webinars. Partners in Pain received a Community Initiatives Fund community grant in mid-2021 for an additional series of webinars, which is what brings us here today. And all of this work is supported by Sask Pain, a nonprofit organization which is on a mission to improve the lives of those living with pain in Saskatchewan. So just a couple housekeeping tips before I introduce our speaker. So please keep yourself muted while our presenter is speaking to minimize background noise. We're certainly happy to see all your faces. However, if you don't want to keep your video on, we're totally okay with that. I live in rural Saskatchewan. I don't live in Yorkton proper, and I know how spotty my internet is sometimes at home. So if turning your video off for yourself, I know sometimes makes a big difference on my end when I'm trying to do things. And there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. There is a chat box. So if you are looking for the chat box at the bottom of your screen, there is a little bubble that says chat. And if you click on that, you can type in. I see Curtis has already said good hello to all of us. Erin has also shared her slide deck so that we can follow along, and she's going to share her slides as well with us at the end. So it is now my extreme pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Erin Beckwell. And Erin and I don't know each other, but I have followed Erin for a long time. And I'm when I saw I was facilitating, when I got to choose, I'm like, it's kind of fangirling a bit. And I was like, Erin's laughing. Erin's done a lot of work in trauma, and I'm very excited to hear her present today. So she's a lifelong pot stirrer and boat rocker. Maybe that's why I like you so much, because I'm kind of like that too. Erin Beckwell is a social worker, consultant, and educator who is passionate about helping create communities and organizations where all people can feel safe and connected and be as well as possible. She loves the challenge of finding creative ways to share information and stories, support one another, and provide compassionate care. In addition to working as a clinical instructor and field education coordinator with the University of Regina Faculty of Social Work, Erin is currently serving as the president of the Saskatchewan Association of Social Workers and is the recipient of the Canadian Association of Social Workers Distinguished Service Award. Please join me in welcoming Erin.
Thank you, Michelle. I always get so weird when people are like, I've been following her. I do lots of this stuff. And one of the things that makes me quite excited to be here with all of you today is, in addition to the stuff that was in my bio, I'm also a person living with pain. I've had pain almost my whole life. And in some cases, it's reached the point where it's been completely debilitating. And I also have trauma. And so that has brought me to be involved in some of the research that is connected in a little bit with Partners in Pain. And so I've been working with the team in Saskatchewan more and diving more into trying to improve pain services in Saskatchewan. And one of the pieces that I often find myself thinking about, both personally and professionally, and in some of my advocacy work, is how we have a long way to go. And a lot of us know that in Saskatchewan, but especially when it comes to integrating some of the latest science about the links between conditions like pain and trauma. And so I'm really happy to be here today and share with you a little bit about how that all works. And so this is a really brief presentation, so we won't go into a lot of detail, but I wanted to sort of touch on some of the high points. And then in the folder that's listed in the chat, and it'll come out by email after the session, I also have a resource list that includes tons of links if you want to check out everything from books to podcasts to websites about these topics. And also we'll share my contact info if you want to reach out and chat a bit more or get some additional resources that fit your specific situation. So I'm not going to do a land acknowledgement, although I will say I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon, homeland of the Métis people. And anytime I talk about trauma, I think it's really critical to link in to the sort of broader experience historically of Indigenous peoples that has involved layers and layers of trauma over generations. And of course, impacts all of us in our communities and in our world. So given that I'm going to talk about trauma, I wanted to just mention that sometimes this stirs stuff up for folks. It can be pretty emotional, especially if you maybe haven't had anyone validate your experience or give you language for something that you've been struggling with. So just keep checking in with yourself. What do you need? How are you doing? If you're finding yourself getting quite emotional or activated, sort of the technical language, one of the easiest things you can do is say, okay, are my feet on the floor? Does it feel comfortable to get them on the floor? Even a toe on the floor can help. And that's literally grounding ourselves. I tend to sit in ways my physio dislikes thoroughly, where I like to tuck my legs up on the, I'll wrap them around like an octopus around the legs of my work chair. And so my feet are almost never on the ground. So when I start to get that sort of very emotional, big flood of emotions coming, that's one of the easiest things to do. You can also try any breathing techniques that feel safe for you. And there's some other grounding ideas in the Dropbox as well. And it's okay if this becomes too much. Look at what you have in yourself to cope, but also it's okay to ask for help and reach out to someone if you need some extra help. But even just acknowledging the space you're in and whether it feels safe and comfortable. If it's not, is there anything you can do to feel a bit safer? That might be having things that bring you comfort, having a person with you who brings you comfort, or even just saying, you know, acknowledging the limits of where you're at right now. And at the end of the day, and I really appreciate, you know, Michelle's reminder that folks are welcome to have cameras on or off, whether that's a bandwidth issue or whether that's your own safety and comfort. Sometimes it feels very vulnerable to have the camera on, and folks might feel safer with that off. So I'm always fine with that. And of course, as a person with pain, I understand if sitting and staring at your screen isn't working for you today and you need to move around or you need to be laying down with the phone beside your face. All of those things are totally fine with me as well. So I'm going to start with a really quick introduction and overview of what trauma is. One of the things I've learned throughout my life is that the way we often think about trauma in our world, most of us haven't been taught about it explicitly, but the way we think about it tends to be very much focused on some big experiences like experiencing abuse, violence, and those of course do become part of trauma for many people, but trauma is also very, very broad. And once we start talking about it, you will likely start going, oh, this is part of my life, or could be part of loved ones' lives or your neighbors. And so trauma can come from any event, series of events or set of circumstances. And so when it's an event-based trauma, which is usually a single discrete thing that happens or that we experience, it's not easier, but it's certainly a little tidier for us to understand. And so single event trauma tends to be things like being in a motor vehicle accident. That might be one example of an event, or witnessing something very disturbing or distressing, experiencing a natural disaster. Those are all sort of things we can point to a day and time and a place, and usually, and say, this happened then, and now things are happening to me because of that. It makes it easier for us experiencing it to sometimes process and make sense of, because it fits a nice sort of logical, sometimes, sort of timeline. But it is also often easier for folks around us to really grasp what's going on, or imagine that it could be difficult because we can point to that event. Series of events don't have to be related, they can be. And so one of my experiences was I was in a vehicle collision, an impaired driving collision, and it was my mom, my sisters, and I was 10 years old. And the event itself was incredibly distressing, but then we were separated. I was the oldest kid, and my mom was taken to hospital by ambulance, and my sisters were left to wait at a stranger's house for our grandparents to arrive. And the only other helpers around were, there were some firemen and some other folks around just sort of watching us, but that was tough. And then we got to the emergency when my grandparents drove us into the emergency room, and all the kids were separated. So we were all taken to our own little ER base, and I didn't know where my sisters were, and I didn't know where my mom was. And that was another layer of trauma on top of that. And then for me, the additional piece of that experience, which was more a circumstance that flowed out of that series of events, was that my family didn't really talk about it after. It was hard for my mom to talk about. She was driving, and I think felt a lot of guilt about what could have happened to us kids. And she had been injured more severely than the rest of us, so her recovery looked quite different. But no one ever talked to us about how it might affect us kids that we went through this experience. And that impacted me for a long time, and came up around times like when I was learning to drive, when I was 15, 16 years old. I had some pretty intense anxiety about driving, and I really couldn't figure out why until somebody said, well, have you ever been in a car accident or anything? Well, yeah, just when I was a kid though. Oh, that can do it. And so those things can all be connected, or they can be quite separate, where they're unrelated events over a span of time. Circumstances can be the most challenging because they're more about just the conditions in which we live, the environment around us. And so sets of circumstances could be things like having chronic pain. It's not an event. It's not something that happens on a certain day. It's every day. And it usually doesn't happen that there's a particular, for some of us, there was an injury that maybe was a precursor to our chronic pain, but for lots of us, that also hasn't been part of experience. So it's more a set of circumstances that is really challenging for others to see, because it's just how your life is. The other piece with trauma is that we also have historical and intergenerational trauma, which impacts Indigenous folks. It impacts others as well, where there's a pattern of trauma over time. And science now tells us that folks who are born into a family or community that has a pattern of trauma over time through generations and over history can actually genetically, epigenetically, transmit a sort of priming for trauma. And so you can be born never having experienced trauma firsthand, but having a nervous system that behaves as if you have, which also then means when we get to this next column, so these events or circumstances in and of themselves don't mean it's trauma. Some folks can experience these things and appear to be minimally affected. And all of that comes down to how our nervous system, mostly our brain, interprets what's happening. And so if we interpret what's happening as physically, emotionally harmful, or life-threatening, combination of those, And even if it's not actually harmful or life-threatening, if our brain perceives threat, it will start heading us down the road of trauma. So different brains work different ways. My sisters and I all were in the same collision. We all have very different ways of understanding and articulating what that experience was like. And so my youngest sister was 4 when we had that collision. She has no memory of it at all, and has never, that I'm aware of or that she shared with me, had any sort of very distressing emotional. She knows about it because we've told her about it. So she has a very different relationship to that incident than I do, in that I've had these sort of flare-ups of reaction to things. And I've even had experiences where my brain has heard things that remind me of that collision. Squealing tires on pavement is a trigger for me. And I've actually had that happen where I've lost a block of time because I hear that and it triggers my trauma and I'm just gone somewhere else, right? So my brain interprets the environment differently than my sisters would. And that often creates conflict in families where you have people who seemingly experience the same childhood or the same experiences, but are processing that and handling it and understanding it in very different ways. Also, when we've already experienced a trauma, we are more likely to experience subsequent events or circumstances as harmful or life-threatening. So we're more likely to actually compound or add to our trauma if we've had that history already. And then it's really trauma response is about the orange stuff, the adverse effects. So what's the impact of this stuff on us? And trauma can impact any part of our life, from basic functioning all the way to our sense of spirituality, meaning, purpose, belonging, and everything in between. We often talk about it as emotional, but trauma is just as likely to impact us physically, including being a contributing factor to chronic pain. And so I'm going to talk in a minute about how the prevalence of pain among people with trauma, but also the prevalence of trauma among people with pain really does tell us there's a connection there. We don't really have enough understanding to say trauma causes chronic pain, but it's definitely got a relationship and a connection there. The other thing is a lot of trauma shows up in physical symptoms that don't appear to have a physical cause. And so people may be trying to access, someone to diagnose distress, discomfort, including pain. And often many of our experience with chronic pain includes this sort of quest to name what's wrong with us. And we may have been told many times that there's nothing wrong with you. All your test results are normal. We did all the scans, they're fine. And if you've had a trauma experience before your pain, being told there's nothing wrong with you, especially if part of your trauma was disclosing that to someone and not being believed, it can actually be a trigger just to have someone say, there's nothing wrong with you, you're fine. And of course, for all of us to hear that when we're in significant pain and distress isn't helpful, and can be very harmful. In fact, can be an additional source of trauma. So trauma is basically anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope. So anything that our nervous system experiences as too much, too fast, or too soon. So it could be too much pain that has gone on without relief for too long, or too much distress and anxiety attached to pain, which can also be a piece that, we don't necessarily have an infinite threshold or tolerance for those things. Maybe it comes at us in a way we can't respond and prepare. So that's too fast. And perhaps it's coming at us at a time when we are not prepared to respond. So it could be too soon in terms of developmentally. Did this happen at an age when we could understand what was happening and make sense of it? If not, it may be more likely to be a trauma, but it could also be too soon after something else has happened to us, that we're still recovering from a previous experience. So trauma is also not just about what happens, but it can be about what we don't get. And so we more often talk about the experience and the circumstance, the event, but not having the love, the safety, the trust, the belonging, the connection you need can also be a source of trauma. Often this is called developmental trauma, and it can be incredibly complex to live with and to manage because it's even more abstract than this happened to me. It's this didn't happen and I needed it. And this is very common with young kids who've experienced neglect, emotional, physical, or both. But it can also be people who are bullied, excluded, isolated, and certainly folks with pain, especially young folks with pain, often struggle with belonging and connection because they aren't able to perhaps engage like their peers, maybe have noticeable difference, which may be a target for bullying, and those types of things as well. So trauma is really about our body, our nervous system, trying to make sense about what is safe and what is a threat. That is language that is very, very similar to how we often hear pain talked about, is that chronic pain tends to come when our nervous system perceives all sorts of things as threatening to us. And that can contribute to ongoing pain. So as a group, folks with chronic pain tend to have much higher rates of trauma in their past, often in their childhood or youth, at least double the rates of the general population. There's actually a reference slide at the end if you'd like to go for a dive into some of the literature about that. It's pretty academic stuff, and I don't know, it's not my favorite stuff to read. So I don't blame anyone if they're like, I would never go into that stuff. But ultimately, there's multiple ways trauma and pain connect. Trauma can be a factor that makes it more likely we're going to develop pain, and that's sort of what the previous slide was mentioning. It could be an accident, an injury, and illness. It could be an overwhelming experience, unmet needs, variety of things that have happened to us, and not just in childhood or adolescence, could be at any point in life. Having pain can bring trauma. And I have experienced that myself, that my experience of pain, especially when my pain was unrelenting and really poorly managed, and I was struggling just to function, the whole world felt unsafe for me. And of course, the experience of isolation that often comes with that intensity of pain really contributed to that sense that, I can't even leave my house. I can't go to things I enjoy. I can't do things I like to do. And so pain, especially over a long period of time, or that starts happening at particularly sensitive developmental stages, so like early childhood pain that isn't named and managed, can be a source of trauma in and of itself. It can also re-traumatize us to have pain, especially without a lot of clarity about where it's coming from, how to manage it, and all of the grief and loss that tends to go with experiencing pain, where we have to look at our lives in often very different ways than we wanted to or expected to. We can have pain be a trigger for our past trauma. So if we've had, in my mom's case, I've now come to understand that the injuries she's experienced in that accident, actually, the pain that she had chronic pain after that accident, very much relating to past trauma for her, in that the experience of pain, having to go to the doctor a lot, being hospitalized, having surgeries, was an echo of a former trauma in her life. She was a kid with chronic pain, just like me, back in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. When pain management in kids, well, pain management in general wasn't really a well understood thing. And kids were seen as not really experiencing pain the same way adults did. And it was believed they would forget about most of what they experienced. So she experienced a lot of procedural pain that was not addressed or even validated as real. And a lot of other sort of chronic pain experience as a kid, which having that happen again after she'd sort of managed it, and in her words, she overcame it earlier in her life, was hugely traumatizing for her. And then that early life trauma, which can come even before we're earthside. If our parents have trauma while we're in utero, we can actually be born again with some of that trauma susceptibility, or that sort of priming for trauma. So the common connections, the nervous system. So trauma is a nervous system condition, and so is pain, right? And so it's where your nervous system is overactive or reactive. And so that means there is some hope there, but there's also a lot that goes around that as well. Of course, with our pain, we often have a loss of control or a sense that we don't control our life anymore. Our pain does, or maybe our doctor's appointments do, and our pain does. And so with trauma, there's often a very profound sense of loss of control, that people can't do what they need to do to stay safe. They don't have control over that. Also, though, loss and change in our self-image, in our hope for the future, our sense of where we're going in life and what that's going to look like, our dreams and aspirations. It often has a negative impact on our interpersonal relationships. It can be perceived that we're not very reliable or dependable, or, there's people, I had someone say I was quite a flake. And that's often, last minute not being able to show up as intended at things, which can be a trauma thing and a pain thing. The invisibility and distress that comes with, being alone in your suffering or not being seen in your suffering can be significant and often contributes to that isolation. Chronic stress that comes from all of this, which can also feed into trauma. And then the stigma of being a person with pain, but also of being a person with trauma. That these are both very generally misunderstood experiences and conditions. And there's often a lot of stereotyping and negative stigma attached to them on all sorts of levels, including among healthcare providers and in the health system. So that's my little blurb about trauma. One thing I want to share with you is I'm actually working through a book about trauma with my therapist right now. And it's called Freedom from Pain. I hate the title. I'll just go on the record of saying that. It sounds very much like cure your pain instantly, which makes me want to burn it. And that's just from having so many of those books in my life that I'm like, seriously. But this is written, co-authored by Dr. Peter Levine, who's one of the most well-respected trauma experts in the world. And he brings this sort of nervous system knowledge, and he's developed therapeutic techniques to heal trauma or to help people recover from trauma. And in this book, he's applying that to chronic pain. I'm not very far into it. I've included the link in the resource list to this book if you want to take a peek. It's not super expensive, so it's under $25, so might be worth the investment. But there's also lots of free stuff out there if you don't want to have another heal yourself book sitting around your house. So any questions or comments? We have a very brief moment for those. Okay, so I'm just seeing a couple in the chat. Words or language to gently suggest to folks that their pain may be related to trauma and that they should maybe look into that. I often find that going sort of indirect about things like, I found this really interesting article, or I saw this really fascinating post on social media, whatever it is. And I mean, the links in the resource page might give you a lot of starting points for that comment, and not going direct to the person. It can feel very much like being attacked, especially if people aren't in a place where where they see themselves as having experienced trauma. And that's often an internalized shame about it, because no one in their life has acknowledged that what they experienced could have been traumatizing. They maybe have minimized it. Maybe they, came from a family, a community where there's a lot invested in looking fine, or it wasn't safe to say, I'm not okay. And so, yeah, the language I would say, just sort of talking about, I've heard that often, thanks, Michelle, that, folks who have pain can often have trauma. And I'm just really curious about that. It's something I hadn't thought about before. And just sort of opening it up more generally to a conversation might plant the seed for folks, or give them a sense that you might be an okay person to talk to about that. One of the other challenges I think people face with this is that things tend to move faster for people if you have a healthcare provider who acknowledges that this is real. And I know certainly for me, that was a huge piece. Was I don't know if I was consciously waiting for folks to tell me there was a connection, and that, yes, that's legit, Erin. You're not just, whipping something up in your mind to try to make sense of things. But it was really challenging for me to even acknowledge that trauma could be part of what happens for me with pain, when none of my physicians have talked about it. And thankfully now I have a lot of folks on my healthcare team who actually do get it. But it took a long time to find them. And it took I had to do some education of them. For a few of them needed some learning. But this is just new in our healthcare system. And so we don't tend to bring this way of thinking into the way we especially provide care for physical conditions, but even mental health conditions as well. And I think it's really important.
Is there any other questions? Oh, you have another fangirling.
Yeah, I'll start a little fan club on social media so y'all can follow me.
Well, I apologize, Erin, if I made you feel uncomfortable.
No, it was lovely. Thank you, Michelle.
So yes, I've seen you present many times now, so I was really excited to facilitate this session today. So anybody else have any questions?
And like I said, my contact info is at the back. And if you too want to follow me, I'm on Instagram, and I hang out on Facebook too. So you're welcome to look me up there. But you can also fire me an email if you have questions that come to you later, or would like some additional information about these connections.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we'll have questions at the end too, if you think of anything as we're going. I do want to share too that the Health Authority has rolled out, and I think, Erin, you were helping with some of those pieces of trauma-informed care that we are now learning to do a little bit more of that. Some of us come from a place of knowing some of those things, and some providers don't. So yeah, so that training is being rolled out, and I know it's being rolled out in medical schools and in other healthcare professional training as well too. So so we're starting. Starting is better than nothing, right? So starting to understand a little bit more. So thank you so much, Erin. So now I'd like to invite Ross to join us. So Ross Mccreery is our next presenter, and he's going to talk about photography today. I'm so excited about this. When we were talking about it at our meeting and he was talking about photography, I'm so excited to see what he has to share with us. So just to share a little bit about Ross, in 2006, Ross was diagnosed with complex regional pain syndrome, or CRPS. With few treatments and no cure for the debilitating chronic condition, Ross increasingly engaged in advocacy efforts. In 2016, he founded CRPS Awareness Day in Saskatchewan to educate the public and raise awareness for those living with the disease. Ross also serves as a board member on the Sask Pain Society as a patient family advisor. In this role, he hopes to help improve and change the lives of those living with chronic pain. He is also the author of several self-published pieces and has appeared in televised programs, and believes in the power of a strong community of rare disease advocates with diverse voices, encouraging change and progress for all. Through work with organizations such as Outrun Rare, the International Pain Foundation, and the Rare Disease Foundation, Ross remains well connected with the rare disease and chronic pain communities from around the world. So please join me in welcoming Ross to talk to us about photography.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Michelle. I'm glad you're excited, because I hope I have something really good here for you today. Erin, how you follow your piece, I don't know, but that being said, it's given me some food for thought for this presentation. This presentation is really a basics on photography. This is part of a wider course that I've taught, and it really comes from a place of when I was first diagnosed, I needed to find out how to cope and how to slow down my nervous system. In living in a world of pain, there was this sense of hopelessness that came, and I didn't know where I was going, didn't know how to, and so photography for me is something that I've been around for the last 35, 40 years. I picked up my first camera when I was 15 years old, and it became a real passion for me. This slide deck that I'm going to be going through today, Celine's going to be pushing us through it, just because I'm coming from a remote location today, not in Regina, but typically I would live in Regina. I'm out at the lake, and so this photography piece really is another tool in my toolkit of how I cope with my pain, and how I sort of almost put it behind me and distract myself from that pain for a moment in time. I want to be really careful here to say that it isn't, it doesn't get rid of my pain, but it's a distraction for my pain. And I think that's an important point to make, because when we deal with pain, for those of us that deal with chronic pain 24/7, like myself and some others, just to distract yourself for that hour or two, is huge. And so we started working with my team, my healthcare team, to look at ways that I could add to my toolbox. And, it just seemed like such a natural fit to go back to that passion of mine, which was photography from when I was 15. We had to make some adaptations in how to, because that was the first thing that hit me was, well, how do I pick up a camera? Now, for those of you that don't know me, with CRPS, it has actually caused my hand. I have no use of my left hand, and I have limited use of my leg. Well, you would think that with photography, how do you get out? How do you get into that setting, that you need to be in order to take pictures? I was making every excuse under the sun to tell myself that I couldn't do it, that I couldn't do it. And I'm here to tell you that you can do it, because there are different things that you can utilize within an arsenal that will, that are there for aiding you. It was a matter of using a hanger of all things to shape to my camera lens, and to be able to turn my camera lens with one hand that doesn't work, just through a loop on that hook that allows me to turn open and close my lens. Little tricks like that, or a stand, camera stand, tripod is what I'm trying to say. A tripod that puts you there and holds that camera for you. And I was giving myself every reason not to. I'm going to go through some basics. This is part one of sort of a part 5 series that I have, that I teach. And it's how you can make an image stand out, because there's a little bit of photographer in each of us. And I want to encourage those of you that are looking for different, if you have a love of photography, then really where this presentation comes from is I wanted to be able to give you some basic tools to urge you to get out and to see that you can use this in your arsenal or your toolbox. And so, Celine, if you just want to go to the next slide, we can start off with some basics. This is a shot that I took at my mom's cottage, actually, out in Vancouver Island. And one of the easiest ways that we can make a really simple photograph stand out is by shaping the background. And the way that you can make that background stand out is to declutter the background. So something like allowing your image to stand out and on its own is a real key piece to how you make that photograph a really good photograph. So this heron that I've taken here, it was actually one that, you know, it was a large beach in front of my mom's cottage, has a lot of rock, it has a lot of sand. It was a huge tide pool that it was standing in, but I really wanted the focus of that picture to be on the heron itself. And this just happened to be about 6 o'clock in the morning. Your best times to go out and take pictures are, you know, your 6 o'clock in the morning when the sun's just coming up, and your sunset when it's going down at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock or wherever you happen to be. They call it the golden hour. I'm sure most of you have heard, but that is when you can get some absolutely sensational. And this actually happened to be a 6 o'clock in the morning photograph, and where the sun was actually coming up and behind me, and you had this beautiful you know, image that you see in front of you right now. So I cropped out the photograph in order and took out all that rock. I wanted that image to stand out on its own, and that reflection that heron was, and that heron, you know, I mean, it happened. I was hoping I could get him as he pulled his head back, but sometimes that doesn't work out. This picture just, you know, I mean, it's the reflection that you really want, and freezing that water. So you want all of that to stand out for you. If you go to the next slide there, the other way that we can make a image really pop out is through lighting. There are various forms of side lighting. There are there's backlighting. There is light from the front. Now, this picture, I wish I could lay claim to it, but this is one that a lot of you in Antelope Canyon, photographers like Peter Lick, and, you know, who is a really famous photographer. His claim to fame is these canyons, this Antelope Canyon. It is, you know, one of the most sought after areas in the world for people to go and take pictures. But lighting is a huge factor. You don't have to have the biggest and best camera out there. And I always tell people that it's these key things, like what I was telling you with background and the lighting. When you light a photograph from the side or from the top, and this one just happens to be sort of, it's a combination of, if you look at it, it's a combination of top lighting and backlighting that make everything stand out in these canyon walls. And when you use these basic techniques in photography, it really amplifies your images. And what I was finding is that in using lighting, in using your background, you know, in cropping out a background, or, you know, and making sure that your photo is using these very simple techniques, I was getting myself lost in the whole process of photography. It's something that I think is really key when you focus on these pieces like lighting and look for those different angles that you can take things from. You spend time in getting lost in those basic techniques, and it takes your mind away from the pain. This is what I was finding, is that as I really get involved in the real in-depth things that make up a really incredible photograph, it took me further and further away from all of those things that were at the forefront, which we tend to put, you know, we tend to put chronic pain when you're living at 24/7. It's right in your face all the time. And so by getting lost in this technique, I was able to put it to the back of my mind and to be able to calm my nervous system down and to be able to just get lost in something other than pain for a brief moment in time. If you advance to the next slide there. So another way with making your photograph great is getting down to the same level of the subject that you're shooting. It really, and this, one of the reasons, again, I wish I could lay claim to this particular photograph. I can't. There are more of mine in here, but I chose this particular photograph because of the fact that it really gives you a great example of that personal connection that gets made when you get down to that same level of a photograph. If I had shot this from, or if I'd been able to shoot this, this photograph at coming down to that level, you stare into those eyes of that photograph and you feel the connection that you get through that level. If it had been taken on any other level and you'd been up a little bit, you would not have that basic connection that this photograph gives. I think that one of the most important things that you can do in taking your photograph is create that personal connection with a person. That's what gives you that warm feeling of, a photograph that you look at and you say, oh, wow, what an amazing shot. When you make that personal connection with a photograph, there's something it does to you on the inside that again it just stands out. There's just no way of shooting it any differently. If you go to the next image there, or the next slide. Now, this is a photograph that I took in Kauai. We go every year, and this just happens to be this particular photograph I remember very, very well. There was a storm surge that was coming in, and these waves were in excess of 75 to 85 feet high. This is the only beach that they would let us down to, because all the other beaches were on watches not to allow anyone, because as a tourist and as a photographer, you want to be that person that's there right in the middle of the action. Well, this particular photograph I took with a long lens, so I wasn't standing as close as what it might look. The photograph really that's cropped onto this slide deck doesn't really do it justice, but I think you can get the idea behind it, in that there's a real you're trying to, and you're really trying to convey that power that wave has. And when you take a photograph in this style, and it's key when you're taking a photograph of any type to really try and capture a moment in time. You want that snippet of something that you're not going to get. It's that one-time shot, if I make sense. It's that story that comes out of that photograph that you'll recount. I mean, this was probably this photograph was about 8 years old now, and but the story that I get etched that memory into my brain of what that particular day was like, what the power of those waves was like. But taking it one step further, it was also what a lot of people don't understand is that for me, this was a special moment in taking this picture because I wasn't walking, I was having a lot of difficulty walking. There was a lot of pain involved that day. And I was able to get down to that beach and I was able to capture that photograph. There's something very special about being able to overcome your chronic pain and be able to get past that disability side of what I was, what my physical limitations were, is really what I'm trying to say. If you go on to the next one. So angles are also a real key piece of a photograph. When you're taking things, they really enhance the look of a photograph. Again, this particular slide was a railway that, you're down at track level. It almost makes the feeling of the photograph as though the train tracks never end. Simply changing the photo to the left, it really completely changes the feeling that you get. By getting down the level of tracks, you create that feel that special moment that you normally wouldn't get in taking a photograph. It also gives the photograph a lot of depth. That's really key in taking of your whatever angle you are on. You're looking for that angle that's really going to add that next level of depth to your photograph. If you go to the next slide there, Celine. Adding foreground and interest. When you add foreground and interest, much of that needed depth to a photograph comes into play. You add things like your rocks as a foreground interest, or it really entices the person that's taking the photograph to explore more, and it pulls that viewer into the photograph. I talk about strong lines with photographs. That foreground that you're putting in there creates a lot of strong lines, and in essence pulls that photographer or that person looking at that photograph, into the photograph. Strong lines can go either right to left. They can go you can go left to right. I tend to say create, and as you can see in the foreground in this photograph, it goes very obviously from left to right, and so you focus the further portion of the foreground, as you can see on the right side, and it creates that line from left to right and draws that person's eye into the photograph. And the reason that we do it from left to right is because as those of us that we tend to obviously read from left to right. If you go to the next slide there, perspective. Perspective is really important. Shooting below or above makes that image a lot more unique. It captures the viewer's attention more effectively. Again, it's like getting down at eye level with an image. It allows you to really change and explore that subject and its surroundings more thoroughly. So by you create a lot of things with perspective, and shooting a photograph like this at the angle that you have, you're putting a lot of those different things into play, as you can see with a photograph. What you're doing here in this photograph, though, is you're really shooting it from below and going up to above. You're putting some more focus on that rooftop, in behind them, but you're also creating a real depth in the photograph itself, and focusing on it draws more attention to him and his glare out to that left side. There's a lot of things that perspective can do, but again, it makes that image pop. If you go to the next one there should be. So in conclusion, learning these different ways to make your images stand out will only help create a better photograph. When you start using them, then you're going to start making your pictures go from mediocre pictures to amazing pictures. And it's putting all of these, it's hard to put all this into a nutshell in about 20 minutes or so, or 25 minutes. But when you put all of these different techniques into play, so your angles and your depth of field and your backgrounds and all those things that I've gone through today, when you do that over and over and over again, you start to, it becomes like second nature. And I get lost over and over in the technique, because that technique, like I started off, makes you basically get lost and you forget about your pain. So appreciate your time and thank you.
Thank you, Ross, so much for your photos and for sharing your expertise on photography today. I'm a very, very amateur photographer, so I appreciated all of the information you shared. And thank you to Erin for sharing her expertise and time today. And a huge thank you to each and every one of you for being here today. Does anybody have any questions for Ross in regards to his photos or photography pieces? Just some chats, beautiful images and great information. I'll be putting these into practice. Excellent photos. Thank you to everyone. Okay. All right, so just in closing, recordings of the webinars will be posted on the SaskPain website and YouTube channel. So those will be shared with you via email. An email will be sent out to you tomorrow with a link to an evaluation. Please be sure to complete the evaluation and provide us with feedback. And our next webinar is scheduled for next week at 2 p.m. at Wednesday, May 18th. And our theme for the webinar next week is pelvic pain with physiotherapist and pelvic floor specialist Bree Retton. Please share any information about this webinar with friends and family and anyone else who you think might be interested in joining us. And thank you again for everyone coming today. Any questions before we close? Comments? No? Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.